Helen kneels beside the radio at exactly 2:45 in the afternoon, turning the dial for the second time because the signal keeps fading in and out. Her coffee sits on the kitchen table, already growing cold. She does not touch it. Not until she is sure she has found the right station. She is 26 years old, living in a small brick house just outside St. Louis, married for 5 years, with her young child asleep upstairs. Through the open window, she can hear a neighbor's radio carrying the same crackling broadcast farther down the street. It is June 29, 1950. Across the ocean in Brazil, the United States is about to defeat England in a World Cup match almost no one in America expects, and almost no one is even listening to. For Helen, the score is not the important part. What matters is how an ordinary wife moves through an ordinary afternoon, following quiet rules so common that no one thinks to question them. Here are rules a wife followed on a day that had nothing to do with her at all. And the last one was not about the score. It was about her, and it is the rule nobody ever wrote down. Before the game could fill the room already had its own rules. Helen always pulled a wooden chair close to the radio, but never too close. The table beside it held the coffee, a folded dish towel, and nothing else. There was no clutter. No loud movement. Everything stayed in its place. The volume remained just high enough to hear the announcer, but low enough that the child sleeping upstairs would not wake. If the floor creaked, Helen paused. If a pan rattled in the sink, she waited until the voice on the radio settled again before moving. When the announcer suddenly spoke faster, everyone knew something important was happening. That was the moment the kitchen became completely still. No running water. No cupboard doors. No spoons against cups. Even the smallest sounds felt too loud. These habits were not written in any book. No one stood at the door to enforce them. Yet families across America followed them without thinking. The radio was more than a machine. It brought the outside world into the home, and for a few quiet minutes, the home made room for it. Only later would Helen discover that the hardest rules of the day had nothing to do with the radio at all. The news from Brazil was exciting, but only for a certain part of the neighborhood. As the surprise score spread from one radio to the next, men stepped onto porches, called across fences, and gathered at front gates to talk about what had happened. Inside the house, Helen's work quietly grew. She poured fresh coffee instead of finishing the cold cup she had started earlier. The pot stayed warm in case a neighbor stopped by. She placed the good cups on a tray, just in case someone wanted to share the news for a few minutes before heading home. Then she unfolded the ironing board at the kitchen table. A shirt needed pressing. So did 2 pillowcases. The work could not wait simply because something surprising had happened far away. That was one of the quiet truths of many homes in 1950. An exciting day for him often became a longer day for her. The conversation belonged outside, while the work stayed inside. No one announced this rule. No one questioned it. It simply passed from one day to the next, until it felt as natural as pouring another cup of coffee or smoothing another wrinkle from a clean white shirt. And before the afternoon was over, Helen would follow another rule that reached far beyond the kitchen walls. The United States had done the impossible, the result was real. But it was not the score that revealed the real rule of the day. It was what happened in the 3 seconds after Helen heard it. That quiet moment, almost forgotten now, tells us more about life inside an American home than the famous match itself. If you enjoy uncovering the hidden rules and untold stories history left behind, take a moment to subscribe. There are many more waiting to be discovered. Now, watch what Helen did next. The front door opened, and another quiet rule stepped into the house. Helen had listened to the broadcast all afternoon. She had followed every change in the announcer's voice. She knew the final score, and she knew why it mattered. But she was expected to let her husband have the moment first. She did not rush to the door with the news. She did not speak as if she knew more. Even if she understood every detail of the match, she waited. He might have heard part of the story at work, or from someone on the street. If he had not, the news was often shared in a way that let him feel he was discovering it for himself. It was a small act, but it reflected a much larger habit. In many homes, a wife was expected to be informed, yet never appear eager to lead the conversation. She could know the answer, but she was careful not to sound too certain. That was the strange part. Helen may have understood the broadcast better than anyone else in the house. She had been there for every minute. Yet when the moment arrived, she quietly handed it to someone else. And without saying a single word, she followed another rule that almost no one ever wrote down. There was one more rule, and it sat quietly in the corner of the room. The radio belonged to the family, but not in the way we might think today. It had been bought in her husband's name. He decided where it would stand. He chose which station mattered that week, whether it was the news, a baseball game, music, or a special broadcast. Helen used the radio every day, but she treated it with care, almost like something she was borrowing. She dusted it. She kept the cords neat. She turned the dial gently. If she changed the station, she often turned it back before the day was over. It was a small habit, yet it showed who was expected to make the final choice. The strange part was that Helen planned much of her day around that radio. She timed her chores between broadcasts. She listened while folding clothes. She paused her work when important news came on. The machine shaped the rhythm of the house, but it was never truly hers. That quiet difference said a great deal about life in many homes during 1950. And before the sun went down, one final unwritten rule would matter more than every one that came before it. By evening, the surprise had traveled through the whole neighborhood. Men leaned against fences, stood on front steps, and talked about the match long after the final whistle. Some laughed in disbelief. Others argued over how such an upset could happen. Inside the house, Helen had a different job. She cleared the coffee cups. She finished the ironing. She checked on the sleeping child and began thinking about supper for the next day. There was one more quiet rule she had learned without anyone saying it aloud. She was expected to manage the feeling inside the home. If her husband came back excited, she matched his excitement. If he seemed tired, she kept the house calm. If he wanted to tell the story again, she listened as though hearing it for the first time. But where did that leave her own thoughts? She had heard every moment of the broadcast. She had waited through every pause and every burst of static. Yet there was little room for her own surprise, or even a few quiet words about what she had felt. The day's biggest story had finally come to an end. For Helen, another kind of silence had only just begun. And that silence leads to the final rule, the one that shaped far more than a single afternoon in 1950. Only now does the real rule become clear. It was never about the World Cup, or the shocking result from Brazil. The deepest rule was this. Nothing in Helen's day, no matter how unexpected or exciting, was ever fully hers to react to first. She could hear the news before anyone else. She could understand every word of the broadcast. She could carry the afternoon on her own shoulders. But she was expected to wait, to make room for everyone else's moment before claiming even a small piece of it for herself. Late that evening, the house finally grew still. Helen picked up the cup of coffee that had gone cold hours before. She took a slow sip. Across the room, the radio sat silent, switched off by someone else's hand. The match was over. The unwritten rule remained. Much has changed since 1950, yet many people still place their own feelings last without even noticing. If this story reminded you of your mother, your grandmother, or another woman who quietly carried so much, leave her name in the comments below. She deserves to be remembered. And if you enjoy uncovering the forgotten stories hidden inside everyday life, subscribe and join us for the next journey into the past.